G. Edward Griffin and Mark Calabria. Edward is the author of A Creature from Jekyll Island. If you haven't read this book, you should. Are you surprised, Edward, on how many people are reading this book now? It's got I mean, how long ago did you write this?
How long ago? Well,
Yeah.
it was published in 1994 was the first year.
Yeah.
And I'm totally surprised because it's a big, thick book, as you know. I thought it would be good for a doorstop. But amazingly, people really have taken an interest in it.
Yeah, it's got to be flying off the shelves because, I mean this sincerely. I probably have 100 copies of this myself because people come up to me all the time and say, you got to read this book. And I'm like, no, I haven't. And they're like, no, you got to read this book. I'm like, no, I have. And so I just take it. It's an amazing read that, you know, most people have never taken this journey down. I want to go to Ronald Reagan here for a second with you, Mark, and ask you, because I've always heard that Ronald Reagan, you know, after the 1970s and Jimmy Carter, which was kind of a mild version of what I think we're in now. Wow, that's scary, isn't it? He came in and he wanted to change some things, and the story is that the Fed taught him a lesson. True?
There was a lot of pushback on the regulatory side, and that's the reason, if you remember, that Reagan reappointed Volcker one time, but he did not reappoint him the second time, and because at that point they were not getting along all that well, and there were pretty big differences in policy, and this is despite Reagan was very supportive of Volcker's efforts to bring inflation down. Most of the disagreements were really on the regulatory side. Reagan, in his Treasury Department, wanted to redo banking regulation in a way that Volcker did not agree with, as well as you may or may not know that the regional presidents have to be approved by the Federal Reserve here in Washington. And so there were a number of people that Reagan wanted to get appointed to regional Federal Reserve banks, and these were hard money people, these were people who were inflation fighters, and Volcker vetoed them. So he kept pushing Reagan's people out of the Federal Reserve system.
Okay. Edward, if people had to know one story of the Federal Reserve that would turn their hair the color of mine, what would it be?
That would be what I call the Mandrake mechanism. That's the process by which money is created out of nothing and put into the economy and withdrawn from the economy. If that doesn't cause your hair to turn white, I don't know what it is.
When they said
when
they said on Capitol Hill, when Bernanke said, we will not monetize our debt, I got on the air that night and said, he's already lying, but he will monetize.
That's all they know how to do.
Pardon me?
That's all they know how to do.
Right, and they monetize the debt, but they're still claiming, I don't know if they are now, but they were a few months back, that they are still claiming?
They're still saying we're not going to monetize.
Yeah, but they are. But they get away with saying we're not printing money, we're just digitizing it.
Yeah, I mean, well, you might remember there was that big interview with Bernanke, and he said there right out, well, you know, we're not creating new money. I mean, you know, they physically weren't printing money, but of course, if I took something, a bank account, and just here we are on the computer and put my money in your account, you'd feel like you have more money. So they were creating money electronically. So he very narrowly said, well, we're not printing more money. I mean, it was absolutely disingenuous. I mean, of course they were creating more money if they weren't creating more physical money. Do you
believe that we are headed for
I think
real tough time?
I think we were headed for a real tough time, and I think we could potentially, you mentioned, you know, a bad version of Carter. We have the potential to be back in the 70s sort of situation. Remember, the word stagflation went away for a while, but we might be looking at a situation again where you're having high inflation and high unemployment.
How many people here would be like the manna from heaven if we only hit the 1970s? Would be like, oh wow, it's only as bad as Jimmy Carter years. That's fantastic. Edward, your opinion on can we get rid of the Fed? Is it possible?
It's technically possible because the Federal Reserve was created by an act of Congress and it can be abolished by an act of Congress. But what must happen before Congress has the backbone to do that? It has to be a complete change in Washington because by and large, the people that are in office today are very much beholden to this creature, and they're not going to do it. So we have a political agenda here.
If you have people who, like you say, can control through monetary policy, you'll never get those people. You'll never make that change because they would control too much of the money. I mean, they could make the pain enormous. Am I wrong on that?
No, you're quite right. In fact, we have the precedent for that during the fight between President Jackson and the Second Bank of the United States. The head of the central bank, which was that version of the Federal Reserve today, his name was Nicholas Biddle. And he fought back exactly that way. When Jackson tried to generate support for getting rid of the second bank, he said, "I will pull the country down." He said, "The nation will fall, the people will fall, but the bank will not fall." That was his exact quote. And he practically succeeded in doing that. So you can be sure, in a contest of this kind, where we're challenging the Federal Reserve power, there's no question in my mind that they will pull out all the stops and try and ruin the economy and then blame it on the fact that we were challenging the Federal Reserve.
Let me ask this one question from you, Mark, and then we have to take a break, and that is, how connected are the central banks? How connected? I mean, how much... When I saw them say, you know what, we're going to devalue everybody's money here for a while to help Japan out, I thought, wait, hold it. Shouldn't you talk to maybe, I don't know, the people of the world? And they're just moving together as one, central bank to central bank.
There really is a bankers club that's been there since the beginning. For instance, I mean, even among mainstream economists, it's generally recognized that the Federal Reserve of New York's efforts to support British pound and support the Bank of England in the 1920s helped cause the stock market bubble here. And you see that it's been continued ever since. I mean, we lent tons of money during the crisis to other central banks. And this is the problem, is that they talk to each other. You know, so their constituency is protecting each other and making each other look good, not essentially listen to what the American public wants. So I do think there's a real problem that they're not looking out for our interests as much as they're looking out for the interests of each other.
Back in just a second. We're talking about the Federal Reserve System, and we're back with G. Edward Griffin and Mark Calabria. And we want to go to the audience here who has sat patiently, and I want to start with Nicole and your question about the Fed.
Okay. In the Weimar Republic, they flooded the economy with currency to like jumpstart it. How much money would have to be flooded into our economy, either in like dollars or percent of the GDP, to have that same situation as they had in the Weimar Republic?
The inflation rates you saw in Germany in the 20s were, you know, off the charts. I mean, literally people were getting paid twice a day so that you could go to the grocery store before prices doubled. And, you know, literally you'd be there at a cup of coffee, and by the time you got your next cup of coffee, it was more expensive than the last cup of coffee. So we were talking, you know, interest rates, inflation, double digits over the course of a day.
Well, you have Zimbabwe.
Yeah, in Zimbabwe.
You have Hungary.
So it's certainly very feasible, but we are a long ways away from that. You know, I think worst case scenario for the United States is we're going to start to see inflation in the high single digits. Now, I think that that's important because even at a 2% rate of inflation, which the Federal Reserve tells us is price stability, at a 2% rate of inflation over 30 years, half of the value of any asset is wiped out. So, you know, this slowly erodes over time. Now, obviously, when you get to something like 10 or 20% inflation, you're just running to stay ahead and protect the wealth you have.
Edward, do you have any point of context here on the printing of money? They're now talking seriously about printing money as a way out of this unsustainable debt.
Well, that's always been their theory. They're just talking about it more openly now. And that's, as I said a moment ago, that's their only trick. And so we can anticipate that's the trick they're going to play. But in terms of inflation, I am not quite as optimistic about the inflation rate, or as impressed by this 2% or 3% figure. I believe that the government is not telling us the truth about the true inflation rate. I think they're fixing the formula.
You think?
You know? I don't think I'm alone in this, obviously. But what is the true rate? I believe, from what I can see, that it's pushing up to about 20% right now. Maybe not be that high, but that certainly is the rate at which gold is expanding, and historically that's always been a very accurate measure over a long period of time of true inflation. Well, how far can that go? I don't know.
Well, here's the thing. Everybody, all the experts will tell me because they've digitized the money, that and most of the money is sitting in banks, that these people who are trying to collapse our economy, they say they got the banks have the money, we want that money. What the experts will tell you is, well, no, we're not going to cause inflation because the banks have that money, and so it's not in the system. It only is a problem when it's pushed out into the system. Well, the problem is not just inflation, but if you want to pull all that money back, you have to pull it back by higher interest rates. Yes. So how high do the interest rates have to be? Let's not talk about inflation. Let's talk about I'm going in to get a loan. How high do the interest rates have to be to pull and suck all of that money back in to the Federal Reserve?
Well, you remember, I mean, during the early 80s, I mean, the prime rate got over like 21%.
Right.
And so one should start with, we are going to see higher interest rates either because of inflation and or the Fed having to raise rates to fight inflation. So
I will tell you that I talked to Art Laffer, this is 2 years ago, and I said, Art, how high do they have to be? And he said, Glenn, I'm not going to give you a number. He said, substantially higher than what we saw in the 1970s and 80s. My question to him was, how do you not stop the heart of the economy if you've got, let's just say 25% interest rate? But nobody has an answer on that one. So how would you stop? How would you?
You throw the economy into a recession. That's what happened in the early 80s. We had a very deep, fortunately it was a relatively short recession, but it was a very deep and painful recession we had in the early 80s. And that was with the federal funds rate of just around 21%.
It only works if you have a free market system and people who are willing to experience the pain and know how to go out and start business. Back in just a second. We're just having an interesting conversation here with Morgan. How old are you, Morgan?
I'm 23.
You're 23. You just asked the question in the break. I don't have anything.
Right.
What do I do, right?
What do you do when it all comes crashing down if you don't have anything because you're just starting out?
I mean, I think you do need to be concerned. I mean, fortunately, for good or bad, you're not in as bad shape as people who are savers. I mean, the people who are really getting hit the worst by this are people who've been saving all their lives, who are near retirement. You hopefully have enough time to plan against this. You need to put yourself, I mean, the most immediate thing you can do is build your own human capital, because labor will always be worth something and brains will always be worth something. And hopefully they can't inflate that away. But any physical wealth is going to be something that you got to find a way to protect yourself and hedge it. And you can look at a variety of commodities, whether it's silver or gold, or whether it's even the food stuff, or even it's land, because all of those things tend to hold their value in inflation.
And then buckle up.
Yes.
And then buckle up. Who was it? Was it Alex or Steve? Yeah, Steve.
That there really is gold that backs the ETFs.
That's it. That's the electronic transfer, right? Of gold. That's the gold. That's paper gold.
Yes. The operative word, I guess, there is backs. When the Federal Reserve started out in 1913, you had to have 40 cents of gold for every dollar that they issued. We're not even at 1 cent for every dollar that's issued. So in no way could you go and get gold for your dollar bills. Now, I think an important part, we talked earlier about what would make people change their mind about the Fed. I think a lot of people have forgotten that up until 1971, when Nixon took us off the international gold standard, there was an anchor that kept the dollar somewhat stable. And you really didn't see a burst of inflation in history until after that happened. So if we did nothing but went back on a gold, some sort of standard, internationally, you get a really big constraint on the Fed because of that.
Let's go back there, because Ed had a question here about the gold standard, right?
I understand there is a bill in the North Carolina House, H.R. 301, to create a state-based currency backed by gold and silver.
And Utah just passed a bill, and the governor signed it, saying we'll accept gold now or U.S. dollars. I don't know how they're going to get away with it, but I want to go there, and can you even get back to a gold standard without massive pain? Next. Can the states that want a gold standard, like Utah, good idea, bad idea?
I think it's absolutely a great ideal. I mean, you can't trust and you can't wait on the federal government to fix this. The answer is going to come from somewhere. It'll come from the states.
And let me give you this answer. I think it's even smaller than that. The answer is going to come from you. Somebody in the audience said, well, geez, if we don't have anything, what are we going to do? Look at our pioneers. Look at the Pilgrims on the Mayflower. They had nothing. They not only survived, they thrived because they had each other and they had God. Look to somebody who actually has some answers for the answer, not the Federal Reserve. From New York, good night, America.